The daylight goes gradually in an industrial city, and when it goes, it does not leave behind darkness in the same way that darkness falls over open country. What it leaves behind is a different kind of visibility, the particular visibility of gaslight and furnace glow and the lighted windows of buildings that continue their operations into the evening and beyond. A patchwork of illumination that covers some parts of the city with a yellowish working light and leaves other parts in a darkness that is not the clean rural darkness of an unlit landscape, but the specific urban darkness of narrow streets and enclosed courts, where the glow from the nearest lamp does not quite reach, and the buildings on either side block whatever ambient light might otherwise filter in from the sky above. The city does not go dark completely. It goes dark in patches, between the pools of gas lamplight, in the alleys and the yards and the back passages that connect the main streets to the housing courts behind them, in the sections where the lamp posts are further apart, or where the lamps have not yet been extended at all. The factory rooftops have been absorbing the last of the afternoon light for some time before the city's official working day properly ends, and the chimney smoke above them has been doing its usual work of filtering whatever sky was visible into the particular industrial grey-brown that this series has documented in detail. As the light drops, the chimneys continue their output. The furnaces do not bank down simply because the working day's formal hours have concluded, because a furnace cooled and relit costs time and fuel, and the industrial logic of continuous production applies to heat-dependent operations as completely as it applies to the mechanized mill floors examined in earlier parts of this series. The glow from the furnace districts, visible as a deep amber light above certain quarters of the city on clear nights, is one of the characteristic features of the industrial city's nocturnal appearance. Not gaslight, not domestic candlelight, but the visible residue of combustion processes that do not pause for darkness. Workers are moving through the streets in both directions simultaneously. The shift change at the mills and factories, whose schedules govern significant portions of the city's population, produces a specific kind of street activity that pre-industrial cities did not generate. Large numbers of people moving between home and workplace at hours determined by industrial scheduling rather than by daylight, appetite, or natural rhythm. Workers coming off an evening shift carry in their bodies and their postures the accumulated physical cost of the hours just completed, moving through the gaslit streets with the particular quality of motion that extended industrial labor produces. Not slow exactly, not incapable, but carrying a weight in the limbs and a set to the jaw and a directness of route that communicates a body entirely focused on the single goal of reaching home and rest. Coming the other direction, toward the factories whose night operations require their presence, are the workers whose shift is just beginning, their movement carrying a different quality. Not fresh exactly, because the sleep available between one shift's end and the next's beginning is rarely fully adequate, but carrying the specific bracing quality of a body preparing itself for the known demands ahead. Between these two organized movements of shift workers, the street holds a more diverse population that the industrial city's size and density generates in the nighttime hours. Carts making late deliveries move through the main streets, their horses navigating the reduced but still present traffic of the later evening. People whose relationship to formal employment is less regular or more precarious move through the city in search of the various opportunities and necessities that darkness sometimes enables and sometimes complicates. People without secure housing move toward whatever arrangements the night makes available to them. A lodging house bed if the money holds, a doorway or an archway, or a covered cart if it does not. People whose commercial activities operate in the evening hours, the various traders and service providers whose customers are the workers newly released from the factories. conduct their business in the gaslit sections of the main streets and in the areas around the public houses and the eating houses and the other establishments where working people spend some portion of the wages they have just earned. The city at night is not the city at rest. It is the city continuing under different light and with a different distribution of its population through its geography. The same fundamental activities of labor, commerce, movement and survival that constitute its daytime operation. The industrial system does not stop at sunset. It reorganizes itself for the hours of darkness and continues. This reorganization creates a problem that the industrial period's growth has made considerably more acute than it was for the smaller, less densely populated, less economically complex urban settlements that preceded it. The maintenance of order, of passable streets, of protected property, of a level of public safety sufficient to allow the city's commercial and productive operations to continue, requires in the nighttime hours an institutional presence that pre-industrial parish systems were built for a different scale of community than the industrial city represents. The watch, in its various forms, is the institution that the industrial period developed and reformed and eventually transformed in response to this requirement. If you haven't already, subscribe to the Sleep-Inducing Historical Archive. Ring the bell for more boring observations of everyday life history, and leave a comment below to let us know how dreadfully boring we are. Settle in. The night has properly arrived now, and the constable making his first circuit of the evening has just turned the corner at the far end of the street. Before the industrial period transformed the scale and the character of English urban life, the management of nighttime public order in English towns rested on a system whose organizational logic was local, informal, and built around communities considerably smaller and considerably more internally legible than the industrial city would prove to be. The parish watch, in its pre-industrial form, was organized by the same administrative unit, the parish, that governed poor relief, road maintenance, and various other local functions that the English system of local government distributed to the smallest practicable administrative unit rather than concentrating in any central authority. Each parish was responsible for the watchmen who covered its own streets, appointing them through whatever local process the parish vestry applied, paying them from whatever funds the parish rate made available for the purpose, and holding them accountable, such as it was, through whatever supervisory arrangement the parish saw fit to maintain. The watchmen themselves, in the descriptions that contemporaries and later investigators left of the pre-reform system, were not a population that inspired confidence in the rigor of the surveillance they were providing. Many were elderly men for whom the night watch represented the final employment available before circumstances beyond any paid work, taking the duty because the small wage it provided was necessary and because the physical demands, at least in theory, were not beyond what their diminished capacities could meet. Others held the position because it had been assigned to them through the parish's various mechanisms of distributing local obligations among residents, serving more because refusal was inconvenient than because the work was sought. The hours were long, and the conditions of the watchbox, the small wooden shelter at a corner or a gate where the watchman spent the intervals between his rounds, were not comfortable in the English winter. The watchbox was, in practical terms, the centre of gravity of the parish watchman's nocturnal geography. From it he emerged at intervals to call the hour, the traditional announcement of the time of night that the pre-clock population had relied upon for orientation during the darkness, to check specific premises that had been designated as requiring particular attention, to respond to whatever disturbances the night generated within earshot, and to challenge strangers whose presence in the parish at an unusual hour required explanation. Between these duties he returned to the watchbox, and the watchbox is where a significant proportion of his active hours was spent regardless of what the official description of his duties suggested about the extent of his patrols. The authority that a parish watchman exercised was genuinely local in a way that the industrial city's growth had already begun to make inadequate before any formal reform of the system was undertaken. In a community small enough that the watchman knew the majority of the residents he encountered on his rounds, and where the residents recognized him in turn, the informal authority of personal familiarity supplemented the formal authority of his appointed position. He knew which houses were respectable, which premises required particular attention, which individuals were habitually troublesome, and which were reliably harmless. This knowledge was useful, and it operated as a form of intelligence that no formal system could entirely replicate. In an industrial city of 50,000 or 100,000 or 200,000 people, and the major industrial cities were reaching and exceeding these populations across the early decades of the 19th century, this local knowledge became rapidly and completely inadequate as an organizational foundation for public order. The watchman did not know the faces of the workers pouring out of the mill at the shift change. He did not know the lodging housekeeper whose premises 3 streets over sheltered 40 people in rooms designed for 8. He did not know the carter making a legitimate late delivery from the carter making one that was not legitimate. He was a locally known figure in a community that had grown past the point where local knowledge could cover it. And the gaps in his knowledge were not gaps in a peripheral sense, but gaps that covered the majority of the city's actual nighttime population and activity. The system built for the smaller community continued to operate in the larger one, and it continued to generate the forms: the watchbox, the hourly call, the periodic round, the parish appointment, without being able to generate the substance that those forms had represented in the environment for which they were designed. Industrial expansion had not abolished the parish watch. It had simply outgrown it, leaving it in place as a set of institutional habits that the new scale of the problem had made functionally insufficient without yet producing the organized political will to replace them comprehensively. The beat, as an organizational concept for urban policing, begins from a recognition that a watchman standing at a fixed point cannot observe everything that requires observation, and that observation, to be systematic rather than incidental, must be organized around movement through space rather than occupation of a specific location within it. The transition from stationary watching to ambulatory patrolling represents a shift in the underlying logic of public order maintenance that goes further than the simple change from sitting to walking that its physical description might suggest. A stationary watchman can observe what comes within range of his position and can respond to what he hears or sees, but his effective coverage of the area he is nominally responsible for depends on chance, on whether the relevant event happens to occur within his field of view or within his earshot, rather than in any of the numerous locations within his assigned area where it might equally occur. The ambulatory constable, walking a defined route through a defined area at defined intervals, converts this chance-dependent coverage into something considerably more systematic, a guarantee not of observation of every event, but of the regular presence of a uniformed authority figure at every point on the beat, at intervals short enough that the possibility of that presence is felt as a continuous reality rather than an occasional coincidence. The beat divides the city into territories, each one assigned to a specific constable for a specific period, the assignment creating a clear accountability structure. This constable is responsible for this territory, his presence at specific checkpoints at specific times, verifiable by supervisors who know the route and can confirm or fail to confirm his appearances at the designated points. The system imposes on the constable the same kind of measured, timed repetition that the factory imposes on the mill operative: a specific territory to cover, a specific pace to maintain, specific checkpoints at which his presence will be noted, and a supervisory structure that tracks compliance with the assigned routine. The analogy is not incidental. Both the factory floor and the night beat represent the application of the industrial period's organizing logic to a specific operational problem. The logic being that systematic repetition, measurable performance, and accountability structures produce more reliable outputs than informal arrangements governed by individual discretion. The constable walking his beat through an industrial city in the 1830s or 1840s covers territory of considerable variety within a single circuit. The route might take him along a main commercial street where the gas lamps are relatively plentiful and the premises are commercial properties whose security the watch is partly charged with maintaining. The same circuit takes him past a large mill whose shift operations produce a concentrated movement of workers at the change times, a flow of bodies through the street that the constable's presence is partly intended to observe and, if necessary, moderate. Beyond the mill, the route passes a row of lodging houses whose populations represent a concentration of the most economically precarious of the city's working inhabitants. Further along, a canal loading area where goods are transferred between road and water transport, where the working hours extend irregularly into the evening, and where the combination of valuable cargo and imperfect lighting creates conditions that the patrol is intended to deter from exploitation. He passes these points over and over again. The same factory wall, the same lodging house door, the same canal bridge with its particular echo of footsteps on the wooden planking. The repetition is the point. The constable who walks his beat correctly is not walking it to respond to what he finds, though he responds to what he finds when what he finds requires response. He is walking it to ensure that everyone whose activities are visible from the beat knows that it will be walked again and at roughly predictable intervals by someone with the authority and the duty to take notice of what they see. The gas lamp does not illuminate the entire street. This is worth being precise about before anything else about its role in the night city's order structure can be properly understood. A gas street lamp of the kind that the Victorian period progressively extended across the main thoroughfares of Britain's industrial cities produces a cone of usable light extending perhaps 20 to 30 feet in radius from the lamp post itself, depending on the lamp's particular design, the quality of the gas supply on any given night, and whatever atmospheric conditions, fog, coal smoke haze, moisture in the air, have gathered to reduce the distance that light can effectively travel. Beyond this cone, the light from the lamp falls away rapidly, and the visual conditions in the zone between one lamp's effective range and the next lamp's effective range depend on whatever the combined ambient light of the surrounding urban environment provides, which in the narrower streets and the enclosed courts is very little indeed. This creates a specific spatial geography for nighttime visibility that is not uniform across the city, but is instead a map of contrasts. The illuminated main streets and their immediate surroundings versus the darker secondary streets. The dim alley that runs between the backs of two Main Street properties and connects them to the housing courts behind. The yard that a building's bulk entirely removes from the reach of any adjacent street lamp. The gas lamp's role in the industrial city's order system is not the production of general visibility across the whole urban area. It is the selective illumination of specific corridors and nodes, the main commercial streets, the major factory entrances, the significant bridges and crossings, the market areas, that the city's authorities and commercial interests have identified as warranting the expense of gas lamp installation and maintenance. The constable walking a beat through a well-lit main street operates in a fundamentally different visual environment from the constable who must check the alley running off that street 30 yards further along. On the main street, the lamplight allows him to read faces at a distance adequate for recognition, to observe the nature of an encounter between two figures before he is close enough to hear what is being said, to distinguish the posture and pace of someone moving purposefully from the posture and pace of someone loitering or in some form of distress. The alley offers none of these advantages. The constable entering an unlit passage must operate with his other senses in proportionally greater capacity and must rely more heavily on his knowledge of the passage and its typical occupants, and must accept that his visual authority in this space is substantially reduced from what it is on the main street he has just left. The lamp's selection of specific streets for illumination is not purely an administrative or commercial decision, though it is both of those things. It is also a decision about where public order authority will be most effectively visible, and therefore where it will be most effectively exercised. The factory entrance lit by gas lamps is an entrance where late arrivals can be seen and identified, where the constable's presence is visually apparent to everyone approaching the gate, where the potential for minor disorder in the crowd gathering at shift change is moderated by the knowledge that the available light makes behavior observable. The unlit court behind the lodging house is a space where the same principles operate in reverse, where the darkness constitutes a reduction in institutional visibility that the people who use the court for various purposes, some of them entirely innocent and some of them not, are aware of and factor into their use of the space. The lamp is part of the public order infrastructure in the same way that the constable's beat is part of the public order infrastructure, not as a comprehensive solution to the problem of maintaining authority in a large and complex urban environment, but as one element of a system of selective presence and selective visibility that together create something approaching a functional nighttime order in a city whose scale and complexity make genuinely comprehensive control impossible. The streets at 3 in the morning in an industrial city in the 1830s are not empty. This is one of the things about the industrial city that distinguishes it most clearly from the pre-industrial urban settlements that the parish watch was designed to manage. A market town whose commerce and production operate within daylight hours empties itself relatively thoroughly after the evening's activity concludes. Its population returned to domestic space and slept until the morning's activity recommenced. The industrial city does not empty, it redistributes. The workers whose shift ends at midnight or at 2 in the morning are on the street at those hours, because the factory schedule that governs their working lives requires them to be there then, not at 7 in the morning when a city organized around daylight rhythms would expect its laboring population to be in transit. They move through the street in the particular condition of people who have been at the physical demands of industrial labor for the hours immediately preceding, not incapacitated, not incapable of navigating the street safely, but marked in their posture and their pace by the work they have just completed. Groups of mill workers, foundry workers, or dock workers making their way from the workplace to the housing districts where they sleep represent a specific kind of nighttime street presence that the authorities must understand as legitimate and must distinguish from other kinds of nighttime street presence that are less clearly so. Coming from the opposite direction toward the factories and the furnaces and the docks whose night operations require them are the workers whose shift is about to begin. These figures move with the specific purposefulness of people on an industrial schedule, a schedule that does not forgive lateness and that imposes financial penalties on workers whose arrival at the workplace does not conform to the timetable the employer has established. The constable watching these workers pass does not typically need to concern himself with their movement, which is directed, purposeful, and explicable by the visible geography of the city and the known schedules of the visible workplaces that their routes connect to their housing districts. The complication for the constable arises at the margins of these organized flows. The worker who has stopped in a doorway to speak with someone, whose paused movement looks from a distance like the pause of someone without a clear, legitimate purpose, rather than the pause of a conversation between acquaintances. The worker who has taken a longer route home that passes through streets where his presence is less immediately explicable by the obvious connection between home and workplace. The young worker whose age and whose time of night and whose apparent aimlessness add up in the constable's quick assessment to something requiring at minimum a question about identity and direction, even though the underlying reality is that the worker is simply tired and taking a moment before continuing home. The factory discipline that governs this worker's time inside the mill, the precise attendance requirements, the behavioral regulation, the surveillance systems that earlier studies in this series examined in detail, does not stop operating at the factory gate. It extends its effective reach into the worker's movement between home and workplace through the street authority that the constable represents. A worker who must arrive at the factory gate at a specific hour must leave home at a specific time before that hour and must move through specific streets at specific paces if the journey time is to conform to the factory's requirements. The street authority does not enforce this conformity directly. The constable is not checking factory attendance records, but it creates an environment in which movement through public space at unusual hours requires a kind of legibility that the factory's own discipline has already trained the worker to provide. The worker passes from the factory's system of discipline into the street's system of observation and back again, the two systems operating on slightly different principles, but toward compatible ends. The doorway at the corner of the alley and the main street holds a figure that has been there for some time, not a recent arrival, someone who has been watching the available options and has determined that this particular doorway, set back slightly from the pavement and partially protected from the wind by the angle of the building's corner, represents the best available shelter that tonight's circumstances allow. The lodging houses in the district charged a few pence for a bed, and some charged more than a few pence for the specific kind of bed that offered any meaningful separation from the other occupants, and the money available tonight did not reach either of these thresholds. The doorway was what remained after the available options were exhausted, which they were, which is why the figure is there. This is a site that the industrial city generates in quantities that the pre-industrial town, for all its poverty, did not produce at the same scale or with the same consistency. The mechanisms that industrial life created for generating poverty, the sudden layoff, the industrial accident that prevented further employment before any compensation system existed to replace the income it removed, the seasonal fluctuation in labor demand that produced periods of full employment and periods of none, the wages structured at the minimum consistent with maintaining a working body that left no margin against any disruption to normal circumstances. These mechanisms were efficient enough that the visible presence of poverty in the nighttime streets of industrial cities was not an exceptional event, but a routine feature of the urban landscape. The constable's relationship to this visibility is governed by a set of legal instruments and institutional expectations that are less straightforward than his relationship to straightforward criminal activity. The Vagrancy Acts provided legal authority for the removal of people sleeping in public places or begging in ways that constituted a legal nuisance, and this authority was regularly exercised by constables who encountered street sleepers in the course of their beats. The exercise of this authority did not resolve the underlying circumstances of the person moved. It relocated them from the doorway to the watch house, from the watch house to a court appearance, from the court appearance to whatever outcome the magistrate applied, without altering the economic and social conditions that had produced the doorway as the evening's best available option. The lodging house district that the constable passes on his beat represents a more concentrated version of the same condition. A Victorian lodging house of the kind found in the poorer districts of major industrial cities might contain 20 or 30 or more occupants in rooms whose area, ventilation and sanitary provision were calibrated to the minimum consistent with the beds they contained, rather than to any standard of habitability derived from the actual requirements of the people sleeping in them. The lodging house keeper's commercial interest lay in maximizing the number of paying occupants per available space, and the customer's options for preferring one establishment over another were constrained by the same financial pressures that had brought them to the lodging house in preference to more adequate accommodation in the first place. When the lodging houses were full, when demand exceeded even the compressed capacity of the available beds, the overflow appeared in the streets and doorways and covered passages that the constable's beat included. The patrol did not solve this. It managed it, in the specific sense of determining where within the city's geography the visible presence of poverty was and was not permitted to settle for the night, pushing it along from the more visible and commercially important locations toward wherever offered less resistance to its presence. The management was real and it was systematic, and it produced a form of order that the commercial districts required. The poverty it managed remained, relocated but not reduced, waiting for the next evening's circuit to start again. An industrial city's street is not simply a public space in the civic sense of a shared environment where residents exercise some form of common right to presence and movement. It is, simultaneously and more fundamentally from the perspective of the city's commercial and productive operations, a circulation system, the physical infrastructure through which labor, goods, fuel, raw materials, information, and all the other flows upon which the industrial economy depends are moved continuously between their points of origin and their points of use. The maintenance of this circulation system as a functional entity, passable, predictably navigable, free from obstructions that would impede the movement of the carts and the workers and the various other elements of the industrial city's daily logistics, is a public order responsibility as significant as the protection of property or the suppression of criminal activity, and in the practical experience of a constable walking a beat in a major industrial city, it may occupy more of his active working time than either of those more dramatic functions. A crowd gathered outside a public house in the hours after the evening shift has ended presents the constable with a situation that is not primarily about crime, though it may become about crime if it is poorly managed. It is primarily about obstruction, about a concentration of people in a public space that reduces the effective width of the street at that point, slows the movement of carts attempting to pass, and creates a node of potential disorder whose consequences for the surrounding street's passability are difficult to predict in advance. The constable's task is to assess the crowd's character and tendency quickly. Is this a group of workers in legitimate and peaceful social interaction, or is it developing toward the kind of disorder that will require more active intervention, and to manage it accordingly, which may mean passing through without intervention, may mean a visible presence that moderates behavior without direct confrontation, or may mean a more active dispersal if the assessment suggests the situation is moving toward obstruction or conflict. The factory gate at shift change time presents a similar though more structured situation. The workers converging on the gate in the minutes before the shift begins create a concentration of bodies in a public space that is predictable in its timing and explicable in its cause, but that nonetheless requires management if the converging flow is not to conflict with other traffic using the same street segment. The constable's presence at predictable shift change times is not primarily about the threat of disorder among the workers. Most shift changes proceed without incident, but about the management of the competing claims on a specific piece of street space at a specific moment when those claims are most likely to conflict. The goods delivery cart whose route is being blocked by a crowd gathered at a market stall entrance, the livestock being moved through a street toward the slaughterhouse, whose route conflicts with a group of workers moving in the opposite direction, the argument between two carters over precedence at a narrow intersection whose resolution by negotiation between the parties has stalled. These are the kinds of situations that occupy the constable's active working time in quantities that the dramatic accounts of policing rarely feature, but that the operational reality of maintaining an industrial city's circulation infrastructure generates continuously. An orderly street is not a street without people or without activity. It is a street where the multiple competing uses of a shared space are managed with sufficient success that each use can continue without preventing the others from doing the same. Where the workers can move, the carts can pass, the commerce can operate, and the fuel and the raw materials and the finished goods that the industrial system requires to keep flowing continue to flow. The constable who maintains this is not a figure of dramatic authority exercised at moments of crisis. He is a routine presence whose continuous circulation through the street's geography provides the low-level management that keeps a complex shared system functional. Step back from the street into the building that supports the night's patrol from behind. The watch house, or in the more developed police stations of the later part of this period, the police station itself, is not a spectacular building. It is a plain, practical, institutional space whose furnishings and equipment reflect the specific operational requirements of the work it supports, rather than any civic ambition about appearance or comfort. A front room with a desk where the officer in charge maintains the night's records. Behind it, or to one side, a small number of holding cells whose iron doors and brick walls are designed for security rather than for the comfort of the people who will spend varying amounts of time in them. A bench or two where constables coming off one circuit can rest briefly before the next one begins, and where people brought in who are not yet fully processed wait for the administrative attention that will determine what happens to them next. The record-keeping that happens in this room is the administrative mechanism through which the night's street encounters are converted into institutional cases that can be passed forward to the other parts of the system, the magistrates' courts, the various forms of institutional detention, the poor law authorities that the night watch's operations connect to. A person arrested for drunkenness in a public place is brought to the watch house, where their name, their stated address, the time of arrest, the name of the arresting constable, and the nature of the charge are entered in the register. The register entry is what allows the charge to be brought before a magistrate the following morning, and the magistrate's proceedings are what determine whether a fine, a period of detention, or some other outcome is applied. Without the register entry, the arrest remains an informal encounter that the system cannot process. With it, the encounter has been converted into an administrative case that can travel through institutional channels entirely separate from the street where it originated. The holding cells receive people whose offences or whose condition requires their containment overnight rather than their immediate release. A man too incapacitated by alcohol to be safely left in the street is held until he is sufficiently recovered to be processed or released. A person arrested for theft requires detention until a magistrate can hear the charge. A person whose condition suggests they require assessment by some other authority, medical, legal, or administrative, may be held while the appropriate contact is made. The cell is not a punishment in the formal sense. Formal punishment requires a judicial process that the watchhouse does not provide. It is a containment mechanism, holding people within the institutional system while the system determines what to do with them. The watchhouse connects the visible work of the street patrol to the wider institutional apparatus that Victorian public order required. The constable's encounter with a person sleeping in a doorway, or with a group of men involved in a fight outside a public house, or with a woman begging at a busy corner, does not end on the street where it occurs. It continues through the watchhouse register, through the magistrate's proceedings, through whatever institutional outcome those proceedings produce. into the courts and the prisons and the workhouses and the various other institutional forms that Victorian society had developed for managing the various categories of persons whose behaviour, circumstances or condition had brought them into contact with the patrol. The lamp under which the encounter occurred on the street is one part of a much longer chain that the watch house makes administratively visible. The inadequacy of the parish watch system as a mechanism for managing public order in Britain's expanding industrial cities was not a new observation. By the time the political will to reform it finally produced a decisive legislative outcome in the late 1820s, it had been observed, documented and debated for decades before reform occurred, and the delay between the recognition of the problem and the implementation of a solution reflects the complexity of the political and institutional interests involved, rather than any shortage of understanding that the problem existed. The arguments against reform of the watch system were not entirely without merit, and understanding them honestly is more useful than dismissing them as simple self-interest, though self-interest was also present. The existing parish-based system distributed the cost and the administration of local order maintenance across local institutions that also distributed the political accountability for that maintenance to local communities rather than concentrating it in a central authority. A reformed professional police force, funded from a central rate and accountable to a central authority, represented a concentration of institutional power over public behaviour that some observers genuinely regarded as a threat to the liberties that Englishmen had historically claimed against arbitrary governmental authority. The continental police forces of France and other European states, which operated with a degree of surveillance and administrative control over civilian populations that went considerably beyond what English tradition had historically permitted, were regularly cited in arguments against centralised policing reform as examples of the kind of authority that the English preference for local and limited government had always resisted. These arguments did not ultimately prevent reform because the scale of the problem that industrial urbanization had created was eventually sufficient to override them in the political calculation of those responsible for governance. The Metropolitan Police Act of 1829, passed under the Home Secretary Robert Peel, established for London a professional police force organised along lines that directly addressed the inadequacies the parish watch system had demonstrated. Uniformed constables, whose uniform itself represented a departure from the informal and individually variable appearance of the parish watchman, would receive fixed pay, organised supervision, defined beat assignments, and accountability structures that the parish system had never consistently provided. The uniform was not merely a practical convenience, it was a statement about the new institution's character, public, visible, consistently identifiable, operating as a professional institution rather than a collection of locally appointed individuals. The Metropolitan Police was not immediately replicated across Britain's other major industrial cities, and the process by which professional policing spread from London to Manchester and Birmingham and Leeds and the other centres of industrial production was gradual and in some cases contentious. The Municipal Corporations Act of 1835 required borough councils to establish watch committees and professional police forces, which extended the basic structure of the reformed system to the incorporated boroughs, while leaving some areas outside that framework without comparable arrangements for some years thereafter. By the middle decades of the 19th century, however, the general shape of professional policing, uniformed constables on fixed beats, centrally organised and supervised, accountable to a permanent institutional authority rather than to the variable discretion of parish appointments, had become the standard mechanism for urban public order maintenance across industrial Britain. Public order had become less dependent on the reluctant local watchman and more closely tied to a professional institution whose continuous presence in the streets it covered was an organizational commitment rather than an individual's personal decision about how much of a cold night's duty to actually perform. Observe, at the close of this study and at the close of this entire series, the street at night and the figure of the constable roving the beat. He is walking the same route he walked 2 hours ago. The same factory wall on his left, its windows lit from inside where the night shift continues the operation the day shift began. The same lodging house on the right, its front door closed now with the evening's late arrivals settled into whatever the building's crowded rooms have provided for them. The same gas lamp at the corner whose pool of light he passes through, his shadow extending ahead of him as he approaches and swinging behind as he moves through. The same narrow entry to the court behind the Main Street building, its darkness unchanged from the last time he checked it, revealed nothing requiring attention and which he checks again for the same reason. The beat does not change because consistency is the point. The value of the patrol is not in the dramatic event of encountering disorder and responding to it, though that happens and is responded to when it does. The value is in the continuous and predictable movement of authority through the street's geography at intervals short enough that the knowledge of its next passage is never entirely absent from the minds of those whose activities might be influenced by that knowledge. The constable walking his beat is performing in the street the same organizational logic that the factory's bell and the workhouse's schedule and the railway's timetable performed in their respective institutional settings. The conversion of the variable and individually negotiated into the fixed and systematically repeated, the substitution of an institutional logic for whatever personal arrangements people might otherwise make in its absence. The industrial city requires this because it has become, over the decades this series has examined, something for which no previous model of urban life had provided an adequate template. Its scale, its density, its continuous operation across the full 24 hours of the day, its concentration of a population whose relationship to the industrial economy makes them simultaneously the system's most essential component and the most numerous and least powerful participants in it. All of these features of the industrial city generate challenges to the maintenance of order that the pre-industrial period's institutional arrangements were not designed to address and cannot be adapted to address without fundamental transformation. The factories controlled time, posture, pace, attendance, and conduct within their walls, producing the disciplined and synchronized labor that industrial production required. The schools, the workhouses, the hospitals, the various other institutions this series has touched upon, extended institutional regulation into other domains of the population's existence. The patrol extends into the street, into the movement between institutions, into the hours between one factory shift and the next, and into the spaces that no single institution's internal authority directly covers. Together, the factory, the patrol, the workhouse, the railway timetable, and all the other systems this series has documented constitute something that is larger than any of its individual components. A general condition of institutional regulation that organizes the industrial city's population into the predictable and manageable form that the industrial system's operation requires. The constable's route takes him back to the point he started from. He will walk it again. The gas lamp at the corner marks the same ground it marked an hour ago, and will mark an hour from now. The factory wall continues to hold the heat of the furnaces behind it. The lodging house is quiet. The court is dark. The city is doing what the city does in these hours, not sleeping, not entirely awake, but continuing the various processes of labor, rest, movement, and transaction that constitute its existence around the clock, under the continuous and distributed supervision of a system that does not pause because the people inside it need to. The machinery is not close enough to hear from here, but its logic is present in the measured step of the constable, in the regular pool of the gas lamp, in the route that returns to its beginning and starts over again. The constable has turned the far corner and the street is empty under the lamps. You stay for a moment of reflection at the edge of the gaslight, the factory walls still warm to the touch behind you, the court dark beyond the lamp's reach, the city continuing its night in every direction you can't see. The beat will be covered again, as always. These are the very modes of operation that ensured the safety of Victorian Britain's citizens and kept the industrial city moving through its darkest hours. Fixed routes, measured time, repeated observation, and the long, quiet discipline of streets that never fully slept. The archive is open tonight and always, if you would like to return.